Good morning, students. Welcome back. We have now begun our discussion on Indian writing in English. We have two prose writers or two prose works to discuss. One is a speech made by Pandit Nehru on which you had a debate, and the other is a rather long essay, which was also actually first delivered as a lecture by Amartya Sen. So these are the two works which, as I have already told you, have a lot of parallels. The question basically is about culture and identity, and you will find that many of the views expressed by these two thinkers who belong to two different realms and two different ages actually do coincide. But the context in which these two lectures were delivered were different. So that is what we will analyze. Let me get the presentation ready to quickly take you through Nehru's views on culture. Yeah, I think Nehru does not need any introduction. We, of course, know him as the first prime minister and a person who's largely responsible for the creation of modern India. But we need to discuss him as a writer and as a thinker. Again, it's not his major prose works like The Discovery of India or an autobiography or the glimpses of world history that we have to discuss. What we need to look at here is a speech that he delivered on the occasion of the inauguration of the Indian Council for Cultural Relations in the year 1959, when he was the Prime Minister. And his views on culture, that is what is the thrust of the speech that he delivered on the occasion. I think that's worth discussing. We need to ponder over its relevance. And when you read the work, I'm sure what stood out, or it's not just this essay, but when you look at Nehrus Contribution to India, when you look at Nehru's works, you cannot but be struck by the way in which he brings together a lot of ideas, things, concepts, views, and attitudes. You can never call Nehru's vision a political vision, his philosophic vision, his historic vision, or his vision of culture. None of these are unitary or singular. What strikes you most is the syncretism of Nehru as a thinker and as an activist. I think the one major facet of Nehru for which Indian history and Indian culture should be, I think, grateful to Nehru for would be the way in which he brought in or imported modern values and ways of thinking from not just the West, but from various parts of the world and adapted it to Indian conditions. There is no denying the fact that the modernization of India happened because Nehru was at the helm of affairs. We are familiar with the very significant role played by Mahatma Gandhi during the independence and also during the formation of the newly independent country, the formation of New India. Now, if Gandhi had been solely in charge of the future of India, I think India would have taken a different course altogether, because Gandhiji's attitude to development was a very different one. It was rooted in the villages of India, and he believed that it is in developing the villages, it is in developing the agricultural sector of India that the development of the country lies. So he would probably have given more importance to agriculture and social upliftment. But of course, Gandhiji was not so interested in taking up political power, as a result of which it was a different group that came into power following the elections, and we have Pandit Nehru being elected as the leader. Of course, that group, the Congress party that came into power, had a view that was in many ways different from that of Mahatma Gandhi, which is why you have soon after coming into power, the new government taking on technology, a technological revolution. They believed in industrializing the country. It was not the agricultural sector. It was not so much the villages that got the prime focus of attention, but the industries. The industrialization of India began on a large scale. You have the establishment of factories. You have the establishment of dams. Nehru called dams at the inauguration of the Bhakra Nangal Dam. He called, there's a famous statement that he made about dams being the temples of modern India. Nehru was, of course, not a very religious person. He was spiritual in his own way. He had a spiritual outlook, but he was definitely not a religious person. He did not, uphold any religious zeal in his doing, in his activities, in his vision. What he believed in was the modernization of the country through industrialization and technological development. So, that is what India has become. You have Nehru insisting on the establishment of great institutions, institutions of national relevance, like the Indian Institute of Technology, then the medical colleges, the various engineering colleges, so a great deal of thrust was given to science and technology and education. It was through these areas that he believed that real development could take place in the newly developed country. And where we are today as a result of that drive. So, when you take on the path of industrialization, you cannot claim to be totally rooted in one's own history, one's own past, one's own tradition. It's a new outlook that you develop, and this mixture of the past and the present, the West and the East, the old and the new, that is something that I think highlights Nehru's views in general, which is why we call it a syncretic vision. It's a vision that is not homogeneous. It's not a vision that is one-sided, singular, or monologic. It is a mixture. It is a heterogeneous concept that Nehru upheld. Therefore, you call it a syncretic vision. And, he did not believe in one religion taking the upper hand in the country. So we have the very strong stress being laid in the Indian Constitution on secularism, allowing all the different religions to exist in harmony side by side. So that pluralism and that secularism is something that, again, we attribute to Nehru's vision. And of course, he was not singularly responsible for that, but there is no denying the fact that he believed in secularism. He believed in the basic unity of India in all its ethnic and religious diversity. And he was very much concerned about taking India forward into the new age of scientific discovery and technological development. And at the same time, you can also, I think we strongly need to take into account Nehru's socialism. He was not a leftist, but he upheld leftist views in the sense that he upheld socialist views. He was not a Marxist, but what he upheld in all his programs can be seen as this socialistic, the socialist spirit. So the concern with the poor, the outcast, and the respect for democratic values. So when you look at the speech that is prescribed for your study, these aspects of Nehru's personality and his vision can be seen as highlighted here. This, of course, was the speech that he delivered on the occasion of the inauguration of the Indian Council for Cultural Relations. What was the aim of this? When he was the Prime Minister, it was his very powerful education minister, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, whom we know as one of the preeminent among India's freedom fighters. He was independent India's first education minister, and it was his initiative, that materialized in the establishment of the ICCR. The ICCR had as its aim cultural diplomacy, that is, interacting with other nations of the world in the field of culture. And its objectives were to actively participate in the formulation and implementation of policies and programs pertaining to India's external cultural relations, to foster and strengthen cultural relations and mutual understanding between India and other countries, and to promote cultural exchanges with other countries and people, and to develop relations with nations. It was a vision of this first ministry that it is not in hard power alone that the strength of a country lies. It may have industries, it may have wealth, it may have human resources. These are all the hard power, but there is something that is known as soft power, and that is what is expressed through its arts, its culture, its various aesthetic manifestations, and that is what is meant by the soft power. And Nehru's vision was in upholding the soft power as much as the hard power of any of the country, which is why so much of insistence was given to the Indian Council for Cultural Relations. We know that Nehru played a very crucial role actually in shaping the history of the world after the Second World War. We know that the Second World War really left the world a divided one, where you had the two blocks, the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc, those countries which owed allegiance to America's capitalist vision, and those countries which owed allegiance to the Soviet Union's socialist vision. And then you have a third front emerging. We have Nehru playing a key role along with the leaders of countries like Yugoslavia and Egypt and so on, to create what is known as the non-aligned movement, NAM, N-A-M, the non-aligned movement, which believed in maintaining equal relations with both the Western capitalist society and the Eastern socialist society. It wanted to build a stronger world by maintaining that third front as a very powerful front. Otherwise, they believed that the world would just be driven headlong into a third world war. So the non-aligned movement, headed largely by Nehru and Tito, the Yugoslav leader, and Anwar Sadat, this non-aligned movement, of course, you had China and Japan and all those countries also playing crucial roles in this, many of the African nations. Now, this non-aligned movement played a major role in preventing the outbreak of the Third World War, soon after the Second World War. And, the very spirit of the non-aligned movement is to maintain that balance, to accept the best from the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc, and then to maintain its own identity too, not sacrificing the identity of the individual nations to either an American or a Russian ideology. So, the contribution of the non-aligned movement is very significant, and you can see that highlighted in this speech too. I'll just quote a few lines from the speech which can give us a comprehensive vision of what Nehru's view of culture is. And he says, the very first point that strikes us is that you can never define culture in a single sentence. It's not a homogeneous thing. It is not a singular thing. There is nothing called an essential culture. Whatever you're talking about, the culture of a country, the culture of a religion, the culture of a nation, the culture of a continent, it's always a mixture. It is always something that is affected by its relations with other cultures too. It can never remain isolated and unaffected by other cultures. So this syncretism, that is his, the foundation stone of his view of culture. No culture in the world is absolutely pristine, pure, and unaffected by any other culture. It simply cannot be, just as nobody can say that he belongs 100% to a particular racial type. Nobody is either fully pure white, pure black, or pure brown, or whatever. You have a lot of mixtures that have occurred, and culture too. And if culture has to have any value, it must have a certain depth. In other words, he believes that culture must never remain static. I mean, when you say that this is Indian culture and keep it at that level, it will remain static. That is a very dangerous state. Culture, on the other hand, should keep changing. It should keep evolving. It should keep adapting itself to newer circumstances, newer influences, newer encounters, and so on. Which is why he believes that culture, apart from being a mixture, apart from being heterogeneous, culture is also dynamic. And culture depends on a large number of factors: the geography, the history, everything, so many things. Geography, you would never think of associating culture with geography, but it does. The culture of Arabia, for example, is what it is because of the fact that Arabia is a vastly desert region. Similarly, Indian culture has been greatly affected by our landscape, the Himalayas in the north, the forests in the middle region, the great rivers, and then the sea in the southern peninsula, and so on. So culture is something that is rooted in the soil of any land, and it is intimately connected to the geography of a land. And he goes on to highlight the danger of a unitary vision. We can almost measure the growth and advance of India and the decline of India by relating them to the periods when India had her mind open to the outside world. As a person who had studied Indian history in great depth, he knew that the highest peaks of Indian history, Indian glory were reached when we were most open to outside influences. The Gupta, the Maurya dynasty, during which which we consider as a golden age, was one when there were a lot of visitors who reached India from other countries. So that openness, not just to visitors, but to ideas from other parts of the world. So, and the lowest points in Indian history were reached when we had a very closed attitude towards such outside influences. So the most India closed up, the more static she became. So life, whether of the individual, the group, the nation, or the society, is essentially a dynamic, changing, and growing thing. So that's very important with regard to Nehru's view of culture. And then with regard to religion, he says, we should be proud of the various religions that have emerged, that have originated in this soil. And they have had an enormous effect on humanity. But he has absolutely no doubt about the fact that if many of these religions actually made the mind of human beings static. In what way? By upholding the idea that this religion is the best and that all other religions are bad, and therefore you should adhere to this religion, and so on. That kind of religiosity, he believes, makes the land itself static, dogmatic, and you become very prejudiced, bigoted, and narrow-minded. And this will definitely have an evil effect on society. Whatever the religious texts by themselves may say very good things, but as long as they believe that this is right and everything else is wrong, then the influence that they wield is one of stasis, which is a very dangerous situation to be in. And which is why he believes that too much of investment in the past is unhealthy for any nation. When you talk about the culture of a nation, don't think that it is rooted only in the past. It may be, but it is equally rooted in the future too. So the individual human being or the race or nation must have a certain depth and certain roots some way. That is true. It must be rooted in the past. But then you cannot live in the roots alone. You need to have branches that flower. Only then can you have growth. So, yeah. Then again, culture, he cannot think of culture as, something that is beyond ethics. Culture is as much ethical as it is historical, as it is religious, as it is dynamic and all that. Without being ethical, you cannot consider a nation as being cultured. So culture means the inner growth of man. Of course it does, but it also means showing concern for the growth of others. So the capacity to understand the other person, the capacity to make yourself understood by the other person, all that is what being ethical means. And culture cannot be, the idea of culture cannot be divorced from that of ethics. And culture should, he says, have its roots, doors and windows open. It should have the capacity to understand the other's point of view fully, even though it may not always agree with it. The question of agreement or disagreement only arises when you understand a single thing. Otherwise, it is, when you understand something. Otherwise, it is blind negation, which is not a cultured approach to any question. So that openness is something, again, that is part of Nehru's view of culture. And then comes, I think, Nehru's own significant touch. If we were to define Nehru, as difficult as that would be, if we were to define Nehru in just one, with the help of just one characteristic feature, I would attribute that, I would think that it would be his scientific and rational outlook. He was definitely not a very religious person. He was not a very, he upheld the sanctity of reasoning, of logic, and of scientific thinking. So that scientific approach to life's problems was something that he believed would solve all of life's problems, and that is something that is part and parcel of his view of culture too. Examining everything, seeking truth by trial and error, by experiment, never concluding anything without trying to understand it fully and comprehensively, and only when one is fully convinced about it and accepting it, the capacity to change one's notions the moment you get proof to the contrary. That kind of openness, he says, of imbibing the truth when it is found, that is again culture. So culture has to be scientific and rational. And then, very often we think of culture as very much aligned with a spirit of nationalism. The Indian culture, very often we hear about the Indian culture, the necessity to uphold the Arsha Bharata Samskaram and, the Indian culture. People go gaga over that, that idea of culture. But he says, it should not be exclusively nationalistic. Every culture, every nation will have its culture, but do not ever make the mistake of considering culture as exclusively nationalistic. Nationalism is a curious phenomenon. He had his own uncertainties about nationalism, very much like Gandhiji. And even more than Gandhiji, I would say Tagore. He and Tagore had this, they were not very comfortable with the idea of pure nationalism. They were more of internationalists or universalists in their thinking, especially Tagore. And Nehru was also more of an internationalist or a globalist, a universalist, and not so much a nationalist. So nationalism, definitely gives strength to a country, especially when the country needs to fight for its freedom and independence from a foreign country. Naturally, it must uphold that spirit of nationalism. That is what will unite the entire people, the whole population, to rally against the foreign foes. But then, the same nationalism, for all its benefits, also has a tendency to give you a rather narrow vision, because you can only think of your country as being different from the rest, and very often you think that it is superior to the rest also. The perspective changes and one is continuously thinking of one's own struggles and virtues and failings to the exclusion of other thoughts. This is also something that will shut your mind to the outside world, which he does not consider to be a very healthy thing or healthy situation to be in. So the same nationalism, which is at one level the symbol of growth for a people, can at the other level become a symbol of stasis, of the cessation or the stopping of growth in the mind. When it is successful, it goes on spreading in a rather aggressive way, and it is very dangerous there. When you think of the Pakistanis as your enemies, that is when you are being aggressively nationalist. It holds the, it's the same way for the Pakistanis too in their attitude towards India. And it is the same for the Americans in their attitude towards the Mexicans, the South Koreans in their attitude towards the North Koreans, and so on. Yeah, then, so culture is not fully nationalist. Then he says culture is socialist too. You cannot think of considering culture without having, as its major concern, the assurance that everyone, wealth is equally divided. It is a folly, he says, to talk of culture when human beings starve and die. Before one can talk about anything else, one must provide the basic essential to human beings. And without that socialist economics, you cannot again talk of culture. So that is, look at the various aspects that he has brought into the discussion of culture. Culture just cannot be considered as something that is, aesthetic or something that is one-sided. It has many, many facets to it. And ultimately, one may say that culture is harmony. It becomes essential that we try to understand one another in the right way, and the right way is important. A friendly approach brings a friendly response. I have not the shadow of a doubt that it is a fundamental rule of human life that if the approach is good, the response will be good as well. So ultimately, you may conclude that his concept of culture was in no way spiritual. Very often you tend to think of culture in very spiritual terms. It was more of he was more of a materialist, concerned about life as it is really lived in society. Not so much about values, not so much about meditation, not so much about a life of spirituality. Spirituality is important, but that should not be the sum and substance of your life. Because remember, you have a very material, concrete, physical life to live in this world. So you need to be bothered about material needs, money, food, essentials. All of these are important. And again, culture is not eternal. When something is eternal, it has a very, what shall you say, single phase to it. And it is something that is static. No, culture is, it is a blend of the secular and the temporal, social and economic, a blend of all of these. Spiritual, yes, but also secular, also material. It is not eternal. It has bits, it is very, very important to be of eternal significance, but at the same time, it is rooted in the present moment too. That is why he calls it temporal, defined by time. This is Indian culture at this point of time. It may be different tomorrow. It may be different 10 years later. It has to keep changing. It is temporal and at the same time eternal and constantly evolving and shifting. It is social and economic too. And therefore, he did not have a dogmatic view of culture, one that teaches this is Indian culture. Indian culture is equal to the culture of the Vedas. Did he say that? Not at all. So his view of culture was never dogmatic, fanatical, narrow, prophetic, analogical, divine, or even godly. This is a quotation from one of the critics. It was one that was a composite of compassion, altruism, concern for others, humanism, and one which was more close to liberty, equality, fraternity, human rights, and one that is based in reason. So these are Nehru's concepts regarding culture. And since you have already done a great deal of work on that, I leave this to you. Please read the essay once more. Please read the article that I sent you also. And if you have the time, do go through some of his other works, like a few chapters from his autobiography or glimpses of world history and so on, just to understand better his view on culture. I think with that, we can move on to the next author, prose writer, whom we have to discuss. This is Amartya Sen, who we think of as an economist, isn't that so? We would not think of him as a writer who can be included in the study of Indian writing in English. You don't think of him as a writer, even though he has written many works, voluminous actually. His writings are voluminous, though of course most of them are on economics. But apart from economics, he has also written on Indian philosophy, Indian thought, and so on. And one such collection is this work called The Argumentative Indian, which has always been in the news. There was some controversy. It's a very significant work, and one which the subtitle says you have the writings on Indian history, culture, and identity. Amartya Sen, of course, and you may consider this as a kind of continuation of Nehru's views on culture. What Nehru said with regard to Indian culture in the 1950s can be seen extended in Amartya Sen's views expressed at the turn, in the new millennium, actually. This was, these essays were of course written over a few years, and the one that is prescribed for our study, The Indian Identity, was actually a lecture that he delivered in the year 2001. The Indian economist and philosopher, the Nobel laureate in the year 1998 for economics. And the argument in this work, is that Indian tradition is dialectical or dialogic. In other words, debate, discussion, and dialogue, these are central to Indian thought. Indian thought has always had this tradition of dialogue and dialectical relations. Dialectical materialism is a term that is very much in the news these days, with that Marxist ideologue, the last, I think yesterday or the day before, delivering a speech saying that dialectical materialism does not have any relevance in India, where you have so much of casteist thinking and casteist politics. To a certain extent, one can consider that to be true, as long as you have only one ideology, that does not allow the existence of any other thinking. That is what he said. Anyway, that is why it's not very much in the discussion. In any case, Amartya Sen's argument in the work is that you can never think of Indian identity as being monologic or one-sided. You have always had the coexistence of different ways, different attitudes, different thought streams, and different ideologies. And it is in their conflict not so much for brutal killing and bloodshed and destruction, but conflict for healthy interaction. It is in that conflict that the progress of the country lies, he believes. So, it's very rooted in Marxist thinking again. And he says that this tradition of dialogue or dialectical relations, conflicting relations, can be traced to the earliest historical and philosophical Indian scriptures. In the Vedas, in all the ancient texts, you can find this tradition of dialogue. It is, he says, in a world where dissent has no space, it is very important for us to remember that we are basically a very dialogic society. Traditionally, we have been very dialogic, but unfortunately, what his political stand is, he's often taken very strong exception to the present government, and he has always believed that, we live in a system where dissent disagreement is silenced, because there is a tendency to allow only one ideology to prevail. He is very much against the principle of Hindutva, for example. Hindutva is different from Hinduism. Hinduism is the religion, but Hindutva is, a kind of attitude which believes that Hinduism is what being Indian is, and that we need to go back to that past, and that is what defines the Indian character, and so on. He's taken strong exception to that stand, and he believes that we need to have that syncretic and dialectical society back, a society which does not allow dissent, disagreement, or protest is not a healthy society. And he takes us through the various chapters of Indian history, the scriptures, the great kings and other personalities who have played a major role in in the growth of India. In all of these, you can find this tradition of dialogism or dialectical relations. He quotes, you go to the Bhagavad Gita, and Krishna and Arjuna there, they represent two ways of life. And, in the coming together of Krishna and Arjuna with the Bhagavad Gita, you can find the roots of India's democracy and secularism, foregrounding the heterodox tradition and reason, skepticism within Indian thought. And he takes us all the way through the medieval mystic poetical traditions, the Sufi poets, the Bhakti tradition, the historical ties that India has had with China, with other nations, and so on, and right down to recent Indian history. And he even invites us to look at, the point that I was just a few minutes back reminding you of, the kind of attitudinal change that characterizes the relationship of attitudinal contrast that characterizes the relationship of Tagore and Gandhiji, for example. Tagore's vision of universalism was not entirely Gandhi's view of nationalism, or, Gandhi was, after all, he was a Hindu nationalist, whereas Tagore was a different one. So in that contrast, again, India has gained from both of them, and that is what Amartya said. Of course, he was a student of Rabindranath Tagore, he grew up there in the Shantiniketan campus. So he was very close to Tagore. That is something that we need to take into consideration. I'll just introduce the book to you, and we'll do the essay itself in the next class, okay? So what you have in this work is a kind of rejection of all the stereotypical notions regarding India. There is a tendency to think, especially among the Westerners, that India is the land of spirituality, that India, this has emerged as a result of various interpretations. You have the Orientalists, like people like Max Muller, Romain Rolland, etc., who again, they gave a specific identity to India, and they highlighted the spirituality of India. Later, many yogis have, caught the fascination of the Western people, who again think of India as the land of spirituality. I'm sure you've seen the image of many white people, who have had enough of their world, and they come to India seeking spiritual solace, whereas we here are desperate for some solace ourselves. Okay, we don't think of India as a very spiritual, totally spiritual land, the land of meditation and karma and peace and so on. It's definitely not that. So he rejects these stereotyped notions of India being a very spiritual land, and he takes time to explore the different paradoxes which are inherent in Indian tradition. And he therefore concludes that the Indian, is not a very spiritual Indian. India basically the Indian is an argumentative Indian. And he exhorts us to bring the argumentative Indian back into the limelight. We have somehow evideyo argumentative tradition nammal kuichu moodi irikkan, adu porthu kondu varanam. Only then will you have the growth of democracy, the growth of the country itself. Yeah, and he does not use, unlike his essays on economics and so on, here you don't have too much of technical or academic jargon. It's in very simple language that he argues, that he gives us a historical view of India and also argues for the retrieval of the argumentative tradition. That is what you have in the early chapters. The chapter that is prescribed for our study can be considered as a gist of all that he says in the early chapters of this book. He smashes these stereotypical notions regarding India, and his attitude towards India is something that is very interesting. He does not say India is the greatest country. There is that kind of triumphalism is not there. At the same time, he does not agree with the Western conceptions regarding India, which have always simplified and distorted the Indian reality. Indian reality is much more complex than has been understood by the Westerners. Let us look at democracy, for example. The Western world thinks that democracy is a gift given by the Western world to India. Definitely not. India also had its own tradition of democracy, and there is we cannot he says there is something much more complex than what the West has understood about India. So India, according to him, is not, as many of the Westerners see, a mainly Hindu country. He totally rejects the very narrow view of Hindutva. He upholds, the contributions made by the epics, the Puranas, the rulers like Ashoka, even Akbar. Each one of them has contributed to what India today is. Yeah, so the view of Hinduism, Hinduism is different from Hindutva. Hinduism is mature enough to accommodate dissenting views, even skepticism. And that is something that the Hindutva movement has been very reluctant to accept. Yeah, so his discussions on the Indian subject, the identity of Indian, that's very significant when you look at it academically also. In the Western academy, it serves to situate third world subaltern subjectivity. What is the subjectivity of an Indian, the third world subaltern Indian? His views have gained much academic interest. And in the national context also, it serves to depart from the very narrow-minded agendas that very often come to the forefront in the country. So the philosophical and esoteric edge of his text complements the reason and rigor of the intercultural exchanges he presents. This is, I'll just conclude now. It's made up of 4 sections. Part 1 is called Voice and Heterodoxy. Heterodox, it is not orthodox. It is not one-sided. It is heterodox. And he takes us in the first part of this book into the argumentative tradition in India and concludes that pluralism and the dialogic tradition are integral to India. And that is why we have been able to develop as a democracy. It is integral to democracy, secularism, and science. It's not something that is foreign to us. In the second part, where he talks about culture and communication, that is where I think he talks about the works of Rabindranath Tagore, the films of Satyajit Ray, and so on, to highlight the role of communication in the development and understanding of cultures. In part 3, he lingers on the present situation, and he expresses his grave concerns about the politics that leave people in poverty, in class and caste divisions, class and caste divisions, and gender inequality. So he is concerned about the various inequalities that disturb the present of India. And in the last part, which is called Reason and Identity, you have, I think, 4 essays there: The Reach of Reason, Secularism and its Discontents, India through its Calendars, and the Indian identity. And it is the last essay that is prescribed for our study. These were actually 2 lectures that he delivered as part of the Dorab Tata Memorial Lectures in 2001. And he salutes the brave ventures made by Tata Iron and Steel, the industries that the British themselves were not capable of, or were not interested in developing in India. But the Tatas, beginning with Jamshedji Tata, they ventured into this, and it became so successful because it was parallel to the Swadeshi movement of the early 20th century. So his premise is that our sense of identity and social motivation can actually play a big role in determining our behavior, including our economic behavior. So this is all about that section, which can also be considered as a summing up of the early chapters of this book, is all about this sense of identity, which again he says can never be summed up as one, as unique or as singular. It is much more than that. And he feels that, the ventures made by the Tatas, who wanted to develop these industries in keeping with India's Swadeshi tradition, but also at the same time established institutes like the Indian Institute of Science, giving importance to new ways of learning. That actually speaks a great deal for that, what shall you say, the tradition of plurality. Yeah, so we know that I'll just stop with his views on globalization. He was what shall you say? As an economist of global repute, it would be interesting to know what his views on globalization are. He is fully supportive of the pros of globalization because it can minimize. It can bring prosperity to the world. It can bring benefits, the benefits of development, especially in the field of education, information communication technology, and most importantly, in the field of medicine. It can bring benefits to those areas of the world where such developments would never have reached for a very, very long time. But at the same time, it has its disadvantages too, especially if in the countries where you receive the benefits of globalization, if there is not enough balance with regard to, if they do not have a strong policy regarding healthcare, education, and infrastructure planning, it can lead to a great deal of imbalance. So he defines globalization as a global movement of ideas, people, and products to ensure that different regions of the world benefit from progress and development in other regions. That is globalization. But let us remember that globalization always involves give and take. We take pride in thinking that zero is the unique contribution of India. Zero, the idea may have been Indian, but let's not forget the fact that the symbol itself actually was Babylonian. So, with that as an example, he states how the Indian identity can never be considered as a homogeneous concept. It is shaped by many streams of thought, and we need to make an inclusionary reading of Indian identity, one that takes into account the plurality of India and celebrates its diversity. We need to accept at the same time the external receptivity too. Internally, we are plural and we need to be accommodative of all that plurality. At the same time, we have also received from external sources, so that the concepts of internal pluralism and external receptivity have to be kept in mind. And this combination has unfortunately been challenged by the separatist viewpoints of late. And that is why he says it is important that we subject the notion of Indian identity to critical scrutiny and assessment. We need to time and again assess the notion of Indian identity, ensure the fact that it is something that is constantly evolving, constantly in a state of dynamic growth. That is what he states in the rest of the lecture. We'll discuss that in the next class. Okay. I'll stop now. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.